Hi there. You know me, my name is Daniel Kirsch, and today we're talking about Chapter 4 in Mass Media and American Politics textbook, the Iyengar textbook, Media Politics, The Citizen's Guide. And in Chapter 4, Iyengar is mostly focused on one single problem that he sees, and that's indexing. And indexing is a funny word for the term that we're actually discussing, and that is as the title says, the decline of adversarial journalism. But really, it's the progression of the way that journalism has been winnowed down, at least in terms of the way the American government and Pentagon have been really disabling their ability to report on what they see as relevant news. Specifically, when it comes to military conflicts between the United States and other countries in the last almost 50 years. And the three examples that are cited in the book that are illuminated in the book are really Grenada, Vietnam, and Iraq. Now, the thing is so let me explain what indexing actually is. Indexing is meant to be an illustration of what happens when the American news media becomes a little too lost in their own journalistic norms. And by journalistic norms, you may be familiar with what's today called, as a criticism, both sidesism. Wherein the media does their best, or a journalist, I should say, does their best to get all the sources that are relevant to a story that they're telling, but then also to present an opposing view. And when this gets destructive, it's because the journalist has decided that they are going to get too much criticism by not presenting an opposing viewpoint, even if they're only reporting facts. But if they report any kind of analysis or interpretation, they're obligated by their journalistic ethics and modern day norms to go and seek out an opposing viewpoint. So this is something that the American government has used to somewhat manipulate the press. And let me explain a little bit of how that's been going. So, as Iyengar says, at every level of government now, there is a press office. There's a public relations officer or an information officer or a press secretary of some kind. And it is the job of the press secretary and the press operation to make sure that the media covering the actions of that agency are reporting favorable information that will get them goodwill among the public. And so it is not their job necessarily to report the truth. It's the journalist's job to report the truth, but it's not really the press officer's job to report the truth. Public relations is there to make sure that there are good public relations. And again, that office may be called a lot of different things, but essentially they're all synonymous with what the White House press secretary's office does, which is try to relate to the American public in a favorable way what the White House is doing. Same thing with the Pentagon. The Pentagon, as we're all familiar, is the American military. It's the Department of Defense and all of the armed forces. So when we say Pentagon, we're referring to just the building, right, that they inhabit in Arlington, Virginia. But the Pentagon has had this relationship with the press that has evolved since certainly World War II, when there was a lot of reporting done. But what we're focused on here is invasions of the U.S. military into other countries that are seen as priorities by the White House and by the military establishment. And usually it's to either displace a regime that is hostile to American interests, or simply to safeguard the safety of Americans living abroad. But often it's a combination of several of those factors. And whatever the case is, it's always the job of the press office and whoever is focused on relating to the news media to make sure that you either focus the attention of the news media on things that are favorable and distract them from things that are not, that the American public might not like. Or it's to, when that's not possible, simply to restrict the access of the press to only those things which are favorable. So one of the things that is talked about quite a bit is civilian casualties in your book. So, for example, there are a lot of civilian casualties that are simply not reported on by the American media because they're not given access by the military to be able to report on what happens when civilian areas, neighborhoods, communities that are not military operations, military installations, are attacked by the military. So what happens is civilians die, and there are casualties. And in the Iraq War of 1991, Operation Desert Storm, there's a bit in your textbook that it's not really come to light. It hasn't really come to light by the time it's being reported on in the early 1990s, but later it comes out that over 3,500 Iraqi civilians died. That could be in Iraq or Kuwait, but 3,500 civilians died as a result of bombing and aerial attacks by the American military. So that's distracted from by the way that the military is corralling reporters and journalistic operations to be able to only see what is favorable to what they want people to see. And so what they want people to see is to focus on the individual kind of heroism of soldiers, or the technology, the kind of expensive new technology that taxpayers have paid for in terms of the weaponry that's being used, or the visual of people. There's talk in the Vietnam coverage quite a bit about one anecdote from an analyst who was looking at a lot of the coverage that happened early in the Vietnam War. It was always the same visual representation of the Vietnam War on the nightly news. It was always just a lot of tall grass and helicopter wind and American soldiers with guns, and sometimes if there was ability to show civilians being protected in some way, that was essentially the formula for visual representation of the Vietnam War. That was cleared really by the American military, that provided safety and security for the press. And so they were also kind of given a wide berth. They were given a lot of room to travel and gather kind of journalistic news stories around South Vietnam at the time. But kind of this was all part of the formula, basically to show the American public through the eye of the news media what they needed the American public to see. And the problem, as you see, really quickly becomes if there's no dissenting voices, if everyone in a position of power is in agreement that that there needs to be an invasion of a particular country, then the press becomes dependent on the military, for example, on the government, to be able to give them as much information as possible. And they don't really have the ability to credibly or knowledgeably criticize any of their actions, because they're actually biting the hand that feeds them, right? Like they're the ones feeding information. It might not be total information, it might not be complete information, but it's enough to fill their column inches, and it's enough to put on the nightly news. So, they don't want to endanger their relationship with their sources, so they rely only on the one kind of overarching official source that's speaking with one voice. So they become dependent, and so the role of the press is no longer to question and become a watchdog, as you saw is one of your questions for your essay potentially, but it's merely to become it's a caricature, but it's not that far of an exaggeration to say they become kind of an extension of a mouthpiece of the American government. So the dependence that's nurtured is then exploited to the extent that the American military and government knows that they can stoke pro-American and pro kind of war public information campaigns simply by giving a lot of the good information in their eyes to reporters to be able to report on. And again, that formula is often just a focus on individual stories of soldiers, or very regal looking press conferences from military officers, or it's simply a focus on the technology that's being used in the new conflict, or it's also in large part, sometimes at least in the case of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, a willful kind of exaggeration of some of the atrocities that certainly were attributable to Saddam Hussein, but there was apparently several stories that the author, I would encourage you to read the textbook, documents as simply exaggerated to the point of fabrication. So the point is that there's a lot of justification, renewed and revisited justifications for the kinds of actions that the military says it needs to take. So this kind of narrative is woven and repeated to the point where support for the military's actions actually goes up among the public, despite the length of a war. But of course, that always reaches kind of a tipping point. But that's a different. That's really a different subject that we're not going to talk about today. So the strategy of the American military in the long term was largely to, at first, restrict access of journalists to military actions. There's one story that's particularly illustrative in Grenada in the early 1980s, when there was an invasion that was essentially a counter coup. There were some left-wing rebels that had taken control of the Grenada government, and they were hostile to the American government, or at least they were friendly to the Cuban Castro government. And the American military saw that it was necessary to invade and restore the original government and constitution. But there were several days that the American media and their employers were demanding that they be granted access to the front lines of this conflict. It was, one of the major conflicts since the Vietnam War. And in one instance, at least, the military had promised that we'll allow some journalists to go offshore on the USS Guam, an aircraft carrier, and you can file your stories from there. And this was really before the internet, but there was satellite communication and things, so they would have been able to do that with some communication devices on board the ship. However, that was a lie, and they just held the journalists for 48 hours so they couldn't file their story. And so this kind of filibustering is something that the military has become very good at, sort of corralling and obstructing journalists. And so they saw that couldn't last. At least that wasn't something that the American public would necessarily always tolerate. So there needed to be at least some cooperation or else the media would eventually turn on them because there would be no information they were being given. So instead, the military came up with in the late 80s a model of of pool reporting, where they would give access to a small number of reporters, and I'm just making these names up, but they could be reporters from the New York Times, ABC News, and MSNBC and Fox, and they would just say, okay, only you four and your camera people are allowed in, and if anybody else wants to do reporting, they have to rely on your footage and whatever information that they get from you. So it's the pool is kind of this filtering mechanism inherently, but it certainly is restricting it to only a few people's questions and approaches, and so that's already kind of restricting. And you could say that's justified for security purposes, but the fact remains that this is a new strategy that had never really been done before. So it wasn't really. It seems like it wasn't done for security purposes. It was done, probably just to be able to restrict access. And finally, this idea was come up with, especially in the Iraq War in 2003, of embedding reporters. And because there was a long buildup to the Iraq War, it was the better part of a year, but it was maybe closer to 6 months that there was a real ramp up of acknowledgement that there would be an American invasion of Iraq in early 2003, that there was significant ability to negotiate the terms of coverage between the networks and the newspaper, news gathering operations, and radio and the like. And what they decided on was this embedded idea where a reporter would actually be in combat units with American military personnel, and they would directly be not only protected by the American military, which is a brilliant strategy, right, to be able to then get that kind of trust and really one-sided view, not only seen but also kind of willfully joined to. That actually the embedding allowed them to really restrict access of reporters to really whatever the troops would allow them to see, and that was on orders from their commanding officers ostensibly. So one thing that I want to bring up, and this is what I've been doing, is really explaining the author's argument to you, and you can read the material and see what you think. But I want to submit for your consideration that there is a connection that the author doesn't necessarily draw, but seems to make sense, is that there is certainly a connection between the acknowledgement that the press is dependent on several things to be able to operate their news agencies in the modern era and in the American medium. And that is to make sure that they have viewers, and we might say clicks, we might say views, we might say just page visitors, we might say readers or listeners, but they need people paying attention to them. And they can't get the kind of ratings that are necessary for advertising revenue to be worth anything unless people are paying attention to them. So they need information. They need good, interesting stories and interesting information, and so they can't just report what they think is newsworthy. They have to report on what they think is going to be attention grabbing initially to an audience. And the campaigns learn that when they're political campaigns. You could argue that a candidate and that candidate's campaign might really learn how to feed these coverage stories of who's up, who's down, who's what kind of speech are they going to give tomorrow, and what kind of dirt can they dig up on the other candidate, and they learn those tactics of providing kind of a distraction from some of their more unfavorable positions and actions, and they use that once they achieve governmental power to really deflect from the ability of reporters and journalists to fulfill their watchdog function. So not only are they not providing a public sphere as candidates, but also within government, there is this tendency to deflect attention from what the government is actually doing and the consequences of what they're doing, in favor of a more interesting human interest story, and something that will be attention and headline grabbing. And the fact that they know that, the fact that they know really what the news agencies need, is what allows them to be able to direct their attention to more favorable coverage. So that's kind of really what the issue is, and I'll encourage you to ask questions about this during our conversation. But I'll just leave you with the thought that this is an example of how the mass media and the news media particularly has several functions to fulfill. And it's really what I'm asking you to do in this unit is to evaluate how well they're doing that job, and if they're not doing their job well, what is it that's causing them to not be able to fulfill those responsibilities. There will be probably one more video that I want to make sure I cover here, and I have a couple of topics that I want to explore, and I haven't yet decided if it's going to be part of this unit or another unit, but I think it might, we might do well to put it in another unit. So with that said, please ask any questions that you need to during class or outside of class, and I'll be here for whatever consultation you want to have about any of this material. And it won't be until next module that we talk more about how to do original research of the kind that is cited in a lot of Iyengar's notes. Okay, I hope this has been informative for you and maybe even provocative. So if it has or it hasn't, feel free to voice your concerns during class or anywhere else appropriate. Okay, I will look forward to talking with you again soon. Okay, have a good day.